Good evening, everybody, and may I just start by echoing Michael's tremendous thanks to Ian for a wonderful past 3 years, and to say how delighted and honoured I am to take up the position of chair, and will endeavour my very best to follow well in Ian's footsteps, and really excited to take on a more active role in the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club, from which I feel like I've learned so much in the time that I've already been a member as well. And so onto the main event of this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Ian Chisholm. So a little bit about Ian to begin with. Born in Edinburgh and educated at George Watson's College, Edinburgh, and then into the University of Edinburgh from 1965 to 1972, Ian gained a Master's in History with first-class honours at the University of Edinburgh in 1969. He followed this with research on the Scottish Enlightenment. He was at the University of Edinburgh from 1969 to 1972, during which time he was a tutor to history students and a lecturer in Edinburgh history at the Workers' Educational Association from 1970 to 1972. This was followed by a career in the Home Office from 1973 to 2004. He was a member of the Senior Civil Service from 1987 to 2004, retiring in January 2004. He worked extensively on policy in criminal justice, police, prisons and immigration, and has considerable experience of international negotiations. For example, negotiated the Channel Tunnel Treaty and protocols, and made numerous presentations at meetings and conferences both in the UK and overseas. So a little bit more further, so he was a lecturer on Scottish Government and Parliament for the Edinburgh City Council between 2005 and 2008, and a tour guide for Mercat Tours. He was Treasurer and Vice Chairman of Victim Support Scotland between 2007 and 2015, having been the head of the Victims Unit within the Home Office from 1996 to 2001, and is also the President of the Edinburgh Burns Club. And I love the final fact, which kept till last year, which is just incredibly wonderful. Ian is descended from Walter Scott, the brother of Sir Walter Scott's grandfather, Robert Scott. So he's the second cousin, 6 times removed from Sir Walter, which I feel just makes everything even more marvellous this evening. So it's my very great delight to welcome our speaker for this evening, Ian Chisholm, who'll be speaking to us about Scott and history, Scott the historian. And so Ian, welcome.
I've never had an introduction before where my rather tangential relationship to Sir Walter Scott was part of, but I thought this audience was one to use that. And in a funny way, there's been a lot of emphasis on people's ancestors. Our common ancestor, Sir Walter and I, is Beardy Scott, but I have 255 other ancestors at that time. And we're all related, really. If you go back far enough, not all that far, you have more people who are your ancestors than there are in the country. So I think I'm a bit dubious about it, but I think I'm quite pleased to mention it. My academic career was very limited, as you will have heard, unlike many of many of our speakers. But I was involved in the bicentenary conference, which was University of Edinburgh ran in 1971. And I brought along, and you might be interested in this is a bottle of wine specially prepared for that conference by Coburns of Leith. So you might want to have a look at that afterwards, and I'll take pictures or whatever. However, my love of Scott was first stimulated by reading Tales of a Grandfather. I remember as a child I got this book down, which had lots of wonderful illustrations. Robert the Bruce killing Boone, Catherine Douglas barring the door to stop James I's assassins entering, pictures of Flodden, Catherine, the Black Agnes of Dunbar, Mary Queen of Scots at Carberry, all beautiful illustrations, and it was that, in fact, that made me think this book might be worth reading. My father told me it had been written for Scott's 6-year-old grandson, and as I was slightly older than 6, 7 or 8, I thought, well, I should be able to manage this. And I think it's fair to say the dramatic story told in the Tales of a Grandfather of Scottish history did kindle my passion for history. All the stories of the wars of independence, and it's a very romantic and thrilling story. But my edition, as well as these pictures, also had the notes that Scott did for the later editions. And those notes were quite interesting. Bruce on the spider story is told, but Scott makes clear in his notes this is a tale, a bit of tradition, may or may not be true. And the most interesting example, Scott devotes a chapter in Tales of a Grandfather to the Macbeth story. And he tells the story a la Holinshed and Shakespeare. But then there's a very long footnote where he says this is all nonsense, and that Macbeth's claim to the throne was better than that of Duncan, and that Macbeth was a firm, just, and equitable ruler who ruled for 17 years. He suffered as the last of a dynasty before a new one in getting rather tarnished, Richard III being another example, of course. So in reading Tales of a Grandfather at that age, I gained not just an introduction to the narrative and spectacle of history, but also to critical history. So I think it would be fair for me to say that Tales of a Grandfather was the most influential book I ever read. Now, Scott the historian. Now, Scott the historian obviously cannot be separated from the novelist, but for purposes tonight I will attempt to do so. Scott needs to be placed within the Scottish Enlightenment historiographical context. David Hume wrote, some years before Scott, "This is the historical age, and we are the historical nation." And there were a lot of Scots writing history at this time. Hume himself, of course, is one of the most well known. His History of England, although it did cover Scotland, was published in 8 volumes in the 1750s, and it was the most popular history of England of the age. Hume was far more famous as a historian in the 18th century than he is as a philosopher now, of course. William Robertson also published a history of Scotland in the 1760, and that was highly influential. And although writers like Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson are not seen as historians, their philosophy did incorporate a view of history, a conjectural history, which I will come on to a bit more detail. It provides a complete part of their philosophy. Now, this conjectural history that Smith and Ferguson wrote does contrast with the more traditional political narrative history, but the relationship is not totally clear-cut. History of England by Hume was both conjectural and narrative, and there were other historians who were more antiquarian in their approach, such as Lord Hales, whose Annals of Scotland was very important, and the scholarship in those histories was very often very much higher, more academic, shall we say, although there weren't any history academics at that time, of course, they were all amateurs, and than in many of the other historians. Hales, for example, was the source for Scott's understanding of the accuracy of the Macbeth story. So where does Scott fit into this historiographical context? Well, Scott was all of these. He was, of course, an antiquarian, as we know. He wrote narrative and popular history, and he also wrote philosophical history, I will argue. Now, it's interesting, his philosophical conjectural history aspect is more evident in the novels than in the histories. Come on to that later. Scott's reading and knowledge was considerable, at least as rich as any professional historian, not that there were any, as I say, at the time, and he was particularly well informed about 17th century and 18th century British history. And another major asset for Scott, he was a prodigious reader, but he also had a prodigious memory. So he very much remembered what he'd read, and in a sense, his memory was as good as a research student's notes. Scott's own views on the writing of history are interesting in the context of this 18th century historiography. He didn't systemize his ideas in the way some people like Smith and Ferguson did, but some sort of theory can be deduced from his writings and the introductions to his novels. He was very critical of inaccurate history, at least in theory, That which is not founded on truth cannot stand, he said. He praised the use of original source material, particularly private papers, because he observed shrewdly public documents often concealed the truth. The truth of today is latched into a lie by tomorrow. I think we're all more aware of that nowadays. But he was less a researcher than a reader. While not forgetting his work in collecting and editing and publishing texts, of which the Minstrelsy is one of the best known, his reading was mainly from printed materials. Tales of a Grandfather is very obviously derived from standard sources, although the later part, as it gets nearer his own time, on Jacobitism, does show some knowledge of original sources and memoirs. Often, though, Scott didn't verify or check his statements before publication. Like Sellers and Yeatman in 1066 and all that, he thought history is what you remember. Fortunately, as I say, his memory was extremely good, but notwithstanding this, mistakes and factual inaccuracies, and chronological errors are fairly frequent in Tales of a Grandfather and Napoleon. Scott was a very fast writer, didn't always check what he wrote, but he never invents anything. Either his memory lets him down, or there is a tradition behind what he writes. And he often displays a critical acumen in handling material, as I've mentioned earlier. He was not taken in by Ossian, for example, but he also found inaccurate sources were valuable material. He said at one point, "Annals tell us what people did, poetry tells us what they were." So he valued oral and written tradition. And he appreciated the mingling of truth and falsehood in this tradition. But he was critical of Lord Hale's Annals as being too narrow in its approach and too sceptical. Although, as I mentioned, it was Hales who put him right on Macbeth. A lot has been made of Scott's attraction to romantic literature and tradition. But while he was no systematic or philosophical thinker, he was a pupil of Dougal Stewart, friend of Adam Ferguson and other literati, and he was steeped in the atmosphere of rationalist Enlightenment Edinburgh. And he did accept, as I say, the leading principles of conjectural history, the law of the necessary progress of society according to economic principles, as articulated by the Adams, Ferguson, and Smith. This economic determinist view was very influential, not just at the time, but more recently, of course. And Marxists, Karl Marx himself, was very much a tributor to the Adam Ferguson and the other Enlightenment thinkers in the economic analysis. Scott was also interested in the comparative study of different states of society. The conjectural history saw progress from herdsmen, hunter-gatherers through to pastoral to the modern economic time of mid-18th century Scotland. And Scott was very interested in these different states of society, in the borders and highlands, for example, compared to other more advanced civilizations, as he saw it, in the lowland cities. And the border ballads, for example, they were interesting in themselves, but they were also a reflection of a certain type of society. And Scott can, I think, legitimately be seen as a founding father of Scottish sociology. The odd thing, though, about Scott is that he never actually wrote conjectural philosophical history in his pure histories. His histories are more traditional narrative. In other words, his practice differs from his theory. His personal preference was for narrative. In his lectures on demonology and witchcraft, he wrote, "I am not very philosophical and have some difficulty in arranging my ideas on the subject." So he wasn't a very systematic thinker. So he accepted the validity of analytical philosophical history, but he knew it was not his forte. So Tales of a Grandfather is a traditional political history with a rather old-fashioned interest in great events, great people, and family histories. Scott actually says somewhere that genealogical deductions are the key to history and often its touchstone. Hardly as a line you'd expect from an analytical philosophical historian. To be fair, though, of course, Tales of a Grandfather was written for his 6-year-old grandson, and Scott admitted it was a rapid and animated sketch with no great depth of research and discussion of the disputed facts, though, as I say, in later editions, notes were included. Scott's historical attitudes are typical of the 18th century Enlightenment in another important respect. He does not idealize the past. He shares the attitudes of the Enlightenment in his dislike of enthusiasm, particularly in religion, and of medieval barbarism. He emphasizes very much the barbarism and lawlessness of border society before 1603 and the Highlands before 1745. Atrocity stories abound in his treatment of these areas. His attitude towards the Middle Ages has been misunderstood, in my view. He emphasizes the superstition, credulity, and ignorance in past societies. And behind the facade of tournaments and costumes and knightly deeds lurks the ghost of David Hume and other Enlightenment historians. Hume was a very important influence on Scott, in my view, particularly in his treatment of the 17th century. In his work, Scott is very critical of whichever party's in power, whether it be Cavalier or Roundhead, Episcopalian or Covenanter, and he is sympathetic when they are the losing side and being persecuted. Interestingly, like Hume, Scott was accused of being too pro-Stuart and Tory and anti-Whig and Covenanter. And I think, given we're in a less religious, enthusiastic age, I think the balance of historical thinking is nearer to the Scott-Hume view of the 18th century or 17th century than those who criticise them both. Scott was very much a man of his age who had an appreciation of the virtues of domestic peace, moderation and toleration. And his religious sympathies extended also to Catholics as well as to whoever was the losing side on the Presbyterian, Episcopalian. So, with all its faults, I think there's still a real, if elusive, quality of greatness about Tales of a Grandfather. Its popular anecdotal character makes it still readable and enjoyable today for anyone, I would suggest, when only scholars read the analytical, philosophical historians like David Hume. Of course, Scott's greatest contributions to history are the Waverley novels. And once again, his views on his role as a novelist are a good introduction to his work. He regarded history as a reservoir of material for his novels. He attached special value to well-known historical characters and events. As I said before, he drew on an extremely rich historical and literary knowledge for his writing. He did little special research, though, for his novels, maintaining they were mere amusements. He did not allow his creativity to be shackled and was light-hearted about taking liberties with strict accuracy and chronology, though usually knowing the truth of them. But he did regard it as important that the history in the novels should be plausible in the field of manners, maintaining this was more important than surface chronological accuracy. The pressure created by his speed of writing and need to make money, particularly after his financial crash, should also, I think, not be ignored in his later works. In response to a critic of his handling of historical material in his Crusader novels, Scott wrote in the introduction to the Talisman in the collected edition, "My violation of the truth of history gave offence to Mr. Mills, the author of the History of Chivalry and the Crusades, who was not, it may be presumed, aware that romantic fiction naturally includes the power of invention, which is indeed one of the requisites of the art." Much of the criticism of Scott as a historical novelist, I think, has arisen from a misunderstanding of the type of work he was writing. There's an interesting anonymous review of the anonymous author of the Waverley novels in the Quarterly Review of 1817. This criticised his carelessness in composition, weak plots, and wooden, lifeless heroes. The anonymous reviewer was Walter Scott himself. The fact is, Scott's novels do not depend on the excellence of plot, which is a formal device to hold together a novel of character and situation. As Scott said, "My aim was to throw the force of my narrative upon the characters and passions of the actors, those passions common to men in all stages of society." So the Waverley novels, in this sense, are character and manners novels within a framework of history. Scott should maybe not be taken entirely at face value in assessing his values. As I have argued, Scott accepted the principle of conjectural history, the law, the necessary progress of society according to economic principles, but nevertheless, his novels follow those principles, and in one sense, they're anti-romantic novels, I would say. Ivanhoe has been called by one critic a thoughtful, mature, anti-romantic novel. David Dykes wrote that Scott's best and characteristic novels might with justice be called anti-romantic. And I would argue Scott's real interest as a novelist was in the ways in which the past impinged on the present, and in the effect of that impact on human character, in the relationship between tradition and progress. There's a discernible conjectural history model for a Scott novel, particularly the Scottish ones. An Englishman or a lowland Scot wanders into the Highlands or some equivalent, from civilised to barbarous society, and becomes involved with passionate partisans, Jacobites at Waverley, Rob Roy and Redgauntlet, Covenanters in Old Mortality. This enables the hero, Waverley, Francis Osbaldistone, Darcy Latimer and Morton, to compare the two stages of society, to observe the historical political forces in conflict. They're essentially passive heroes, never acting but perpetually acted upon, as Nigel says in The Fortunes of Nigel. They're inevitably rather dull, insipid heroes. Action depends on the dark heroes, Fergus MacIver, Rob Roy, Hugh Redgauntlet. And the dark heroes lose because of the changes brought about by economic change and development according to the principles of conjectural history, argued by the Adams, Smith and Ferguson. Sometimes the contrast is even made more explicit, such as the civilised spa of St. Ronan's Well surrounded by barbarous country. The passive heroes become involved with the representatives of barbaric society, even in the case of Waverley joining the cause, and have personal links with both sides. But in the end, they put heroic ideals behind them and return to the foibles of ordinary humanity. Underlying his Scottish novels is a sense of the inevitability of necessary progress and the impotence of traditional heroism. For example, Scott's comments on the breakdown of the clan system match those of the conjectural historians. He saw the decline of the feudal master-servant relationship being brought about by the increase in the division of labour and the growth of private property rights, with the chiefs using their incomes on their own wants and luxuries. So Jacobitism is seen as artificially preserving a system which was already dying. And the final ending of Jacobitism is, of course, brilliantly shown at the end of Redgauntlet, where the government allows the conspirators to disperse as they are harmless. Jacobitism dissolves because it is an unreal anachronism in the modern world. While Scott accepted the principle of conjectural history, his attitude towards it is a bit more complex and ambivalent. Scott recognised the benefits of the Union and of civilisation in the 18th century, but he did regret the ending of Scotland's independence and passing of the old heroic way of life. And the balance of his love of the past and acceptance of the present is a tension worked out in the novels, and it was a precarious balance, capable at times of being overthrown, as shown in The Bride of Lammermoor. It's also a tension worked out in his life. Some of the most sympathetically treated characters in the novels are those who come to make themselves at home in the modern world without altogether repudiating the old. Characters such as Councillor Playdell, Baron Bradwardine, Daly Nicol-Jardy and Jonathan Oldbuck. So you have the paradox that Scott wrote books about the past and collected antiquarian relics, but he was also an improving landlord and gas company chairman. But his crazy financial schemes and dreams of land in Abbotsford suggest his life was less balanced than might appear. The romances produced the means for the respectable gentleman to squander. Now, the historical intentions and achievements of Scott have been misunderstood because of the effects of his work. As Lord Cockburn said, Scotland never owed as much to one man. The picture that Scotland presents to the world, the emphasis on Highland culture as representing Scotland as a whole, owes much, as we know, to Scott. While Scott did show the inevitable and desirable defeat of Jacobitism, both in Tales of a Grandfather and in the novels, there's no doubt his portrayal of Jacobitism and incorporation of Highland culture into Scottish identity has been hugely influential. The Jacobites may have lost the cause, but they won the culture war through novels, films and songs. It's question mark how it was, what Scott's responsibility that his readers were more enchanted by the picturesque and romance rather than the realism of conjectural history. Mark Twain, in saying Scott is in great measure responsible for the American Civil War, shows the dangers of arguing intentions from effects. And we had a very good lecture, as some of you may remember, a few years ago from Andrew Hook on that subject. It's not just in Scottish areas of history that Scott's influence has been considerable. A notable effect is in his portrayal of Robin Hood in Ivanhoe. None of the old ballads about Robin Hood suggested he stood for the oppressed Anglo-Saxons against the Norman oppressor. That role was foisted on Robin by Scott. Sorry. His historical premise, that's quoting Scott, 4 generations had not sufficed to blend the hostile blood of the Normans and Anglo-Saxons, or to unite by common language or mutual interest 2 hostile races, one of which still felt the elation of triumph, while the other groaned under all the consequences of defeat. Well, this is not a view shared by contemporary writers in the period he's meant to be writing about. Contemporary English writers stated that amongst free men, English and Norman could no longer be distinguished. Nevertheless, Scott's portrayal has become the default setting of Robin Hood in all subsequent stories and films. Another area where Scott's novels have been hugely influential on historical understanding is in dealing with the Crusades. In his Crusader novels, he depicts the Muslims as sophisticated and civilized, while the Crusaders are all brutes and barbarous. And this has become the established view in subsequent literary and film portrayals. Interestingly, when Sir Ridley Scott's film about the capture of Jerusalem by Saladin, Kingdom of Heaven, was released in 2004, it was attacked by academics as unhistorical rubbish, based on Sir Walter Scott's views. And Sir Ridley Scott himself did acknowledge the influence of Scott. And I think these 2 examples, and there are others, are quite interesting because they do show that most people get their understanding of history not through academic historians, but through novels, plays and films. And arguably the 2 most influential writers in this respect are Shakespeare and Scott. But Scott's influence on the writing of history by professional historians has been more positive. G.M. Young wrote, "Gibbon's incomprehension of medieval Europe is the measure of what history owes to Scott." And Thomas Carlyle wrote, "These historical novels have taught all men this truth, that the bygone ages of the world were actually filled by living men, not protocols, state papers, controversies and abstractions of men." And Scott's the first great writer to be interested in the common people as well as the great. The low-life characters in the novels are often seen as the most real and best drawn, because Scott is able to use their dialogue and idiom to create much more dramatic speech. The significance of this interest in ordinary people has long been appreciated, especially by Marxists such as George Lucas. And so while Scott may have had a lasting distorting effect upon the popular mind by giving history an aura of romance, he's shown other historians how to handle source material, how to portray the past as an entire culture. And that is his real contribution to the study and understanding of history. Happy to take questions, of course.
Yes, Ian, thank you ever so much for such a rich and enlightening and truly very interesting talk about Scott. And I think you're right when you say we often think about Scott, the romantic and the
Yes.
dreamer and his imagination, but give him perhaps less time when we're considering his more analytical and rational and his historical kind of knowledge and context as well. So it's really interesting to think about it in those terms. And of course, as Ian says, I'd like to invite our audience for any questions that you may have for a speaker.
Eric.
Yeah.
One back row item from the back row. This morning, I have been reading just a wee bookie, a very condensed take on Hobsbawm's take on the French Revolution, because that is dedicated on changes and new ideas contesting in Europe. 1790 beforehand, preconditions and all that. That whole phase lasted 30 formative years for Walter Scott, so the whole time that you might be considering history, I wonder if any reflections on his view of all that was happening in Europe from mid-1790s through to 1825, post-Napoleonic, because his last work, and it's not, as historian, is not much spoken about. Hardly anybody's even got it except a short version, and that's his biography of Napoleon. But his piece studying any influence, because he was all in militia a lot of the time. He's a practical man, he wasn't a historian, a practical man in militia, guarding against should have been a French invasion. Is there any writing in on the historical influences on him to say, keep a watch on what's happening in Europe? And this is the whole utility of history.
Well, as I said, while accepting the principles of philosophical history, he wasn't very analytical, and I think the short answer is no. Scott supported, as a sort of Tory, he supported the government approach. He regarded the French Revolution with horror, and what's interesting though is his novels probably had more effect later in encouraging the nationalist romantic movements in other countries. Again, possibly arguably misreading the history in them. But I don't think I'm not aware of any great influence on his historical thinking about the French Revolution, except to confirm him, I suppose, in his views that are more traditional. He was, of course, opposed to the 1832 Great Reform Act, and arguably his reputation in Scotland since is partly influenced by his high Toryism, as distinct from Robert Burns, who of course was supporting a more democratic approach at the time. Right.
I'm just checking to see if Peter Garnstone's here, because otherwise I think we might get in trouble for this. I think I remember reading a piece by Peter from a few years ago, very few years ago, where he does talk about Scott being steeped in that culture of conjectural history,
Yes.
but not necessarily knowing his way about it. And your comments on Scott using printed sources made me think quite a lot about his another history he writes, his essay on the drama, where he essentially this is something about which he has presumably encyclopedic knowledge. That he's intimately involved with the drama and theatre for his entire life.
Yes.
But he leans very heavily on one German source, these lectures from August Wilhelm Schlegel. And in a sense, there's not a whiff of conjectural history in his treatment. He more or less sort of follows Schlegel's take on things. Until the very end, he does say, well, this is, here are some, economic and so on reasons why, here are the material reasons why things aren't working. But then when you think about it, this interest in the material side is less from a philosophically informed take on how theatre has progressed, but it's instead because he's got knowledge of working with theatre managers, so it kind of passes under that. And that just sort of came to mind of, I suppose, because of his intimate knowledge of the workings of all these different things different pies that he had his fingers in for his lifetime, he'd be able to make these connections without necessarily kind of grasping the analytical historian.
Well, I think that's right. But as I said, he was a very fast writer.
Yeah.
In churning it out because of the need to get the money in, and then once the financial crisis, even faster. So it's no surprise. I mean, it's amazing what he produced, but as you say, he wasn't a systematic thinker. But he's imbued the principles of the Enlightenment conjectural history, and that comes in the novels. But I don't think he ever wrote anything that suggests that he was in any systematic way. You just read Smith and Ferguson, and that was fine, and use it to apply to the novels.
Just to keep following you,
Yeah.
can you remind us of Scott's interest and in doing biography? I'm thinking, did he not do a biography of an Irish, was it Oliver Goldsmith or somebody in Ireland that Scott, somebody else might tell us, that he did journeyman-like work on, almost like John Buchan did biographical work on Montrose and Scott and all that. One great I think it must be pretty well unknown, the biographical work that Scott did.
Well, apart from, of course, as you said, for the Napoleon, which he found quite a labour.
He went to Ireland, famously, and he went on a short visit to Ireland.
Yes.
At one time, and I forget who he actually went to
Did
do
he?
a biography on and research.
No, I can't remember, but he was, of course, he patron to the Edgeworths, and the Irish writers who preceded him. I'm not aware of a biography of any. No.
Yes, he's done one.
Okay, well.
Digging the depths for that.
Lee.
I've read the Tales of a Grandfather, but not the edition you've had. Was it at all apologetic for some of the anachronisms or errors?
No, in the edition I've got, which was published at the, I mean, there were so many editions, but this is I've got a 9th century with these lovely pictures, but in the collected work for the Complete Scot, the 1828 type, he did have a whole series of notes on everything referring to all sorts of sources. So he obviously thought this was necessary. The Macbeth thing is interesting because it's so long, his note, but he's got lots of other notes on other aspects. And I think he's a great fan of putting in all the legends and stories, but he sometimes in the notes said, well, you know, tradition's not always wrong. But, so that was fair enough. That's why it's a critical history. I mean, he comes very well, I think, out of Tales of the Grandfather.
It's just amazing, considering when you read Scott, he comes across as being so authoritarian in his understanding. You just take it as gospel what he writes.
Well, the original edition, of course, didn't have notes, and he got some criticism from that. Possibly, Macbeth would be a good example, because Lord Hales has shown that Shakespeare and Holinshed were wrong. It was the usual trash the previous dynasty's lost member. And he may have been influenced by that to do these notes for the collected edition. And they stayed in later editions. Mine's a late 19th century, early 20th grandfather, my grandfather's one actually. But yes, so, and it's still very readable, I think. Obviously, I've reread it. I don't, you know, it's just as good as any introduction to Scottish history as you can get, in my view. He writes so well, it's so magnificent, the stories are so great.
I wonder if I can ask you a question of my own as well. I was struck by something you said about the history being the sort of framework that Scott uses to shed light on characters and manners, which really rings true for me. But I wondered how that sort of, I'm thinking that there's only one Scott novel that's set in his sort of contemporary time, I believe it's St. Ronan's Well, and so he does turn to history for that sort of, do you think that's because he thinks history does a better job of shedding that light on characters and manners in a way that the modern world doesn't, or is there another reason perhaps?
I always think historical novelists have the advantage of they've got the plot. You know, things happen as they happen, and you just have to work out how it works. So, I mean, if I was writing a novel, it would be on that basis, so having to think about and create a plot. The Antiquary, of course, is fairly, you know, within Scott's lifetime too. And I think that may be it. And I mean, he did write incredibly fast, study some history, and his later ones, when he's not quite as familiar, even the medieval ones are still pretty good in my view. I mean, obviously they're only as good in history as the views of historians of the time, and they're very often out of date. But I think for the time, he was clearly up with the latest thinking. Hume, as I say, is clearly a major source. And no one reads Hume now, but he's such an important story. My friend Nick Phillipson, who I mentioned, who was my supervisor, he wrote a very good analysis of Hume as a historian, which is a series which I recommend to anyone.
Ian,
yes.
One thing that I was wondering about, that most historians rely on written sources, and in the case of Scott, that this must be the case for much of what he wrote, but at the same time, when he was writing about the Jacobite wars, etc., then he was able to rely on verbal sources. And I'd have thought that that's, you commented in your talk on the fact that he had an extraordinarily good memory. And is it not the case that probably through his father, who was a practicing lawyer and who saw a great variety of clients over a fairly long period of time, is it not possible that the verbal sources have been extremely important in Scott's novels?
Well, I don't. I mean, the famous Murray of Broughton story when he comes to visit Scott's father, and Scott's the source of that, but that isn't used in any novel, and it's a slightly embarrassing story in terms of his mother. I think there is evidence that he knew some Jacobites, obviously still around, and were able to fill him in on things. So it's slightly more. But again, there's quite a lot of writings around by then. So I think the oral thing comes more into when he's collecting things like the Border Ballads, where he needs a bit of background and is able to try and get. So he's quite good at that. But I think for a history, I think it's mainly printed sources, and with a bit of anecdote for later, later histories in the 18th century.
I think that The Surgeon's Daughter is an example which relies on verbal sources.
Yes. Well, yes. Not one I've read, I have to say.
Are there any further questions for Ian?
No, opportunities afterwards for discussion.
Absolutely, yes. Well then, if I can invite David Mclean to come and give the vote of thanks.
Well, thank you. This is a very easy task, because it was a wonderful talk, wasn't it? The only disappointment of this evening is that this bottle's empty.
I know, it's available for looking and taking away or whatever, yes.
But nonetheless, we're all due you a deep sense of gratitude and thanks for what was not only a personal but a scholarly and insightful lecture. So thank you very much, Ian. I think by examining Scott as a historian, you've really got to the fundamental part of how we understand Scott. Because if you don't understand Scott as a historian, you don't understand Scott. And you were able to give us an insight not into only his thinking and his life, but his writing across a number of genres, literary genres. You placed him in the narrative of Scottish Enlightenment thinking, both as a narrative historian, a conjectural historian, as a philosophical historian. How we fitted into that, but also how we contrasted. And I think it's very telling. You mentioned Hume, little read today, despite his historical credentials. Throw in there the rest of them, Robertson, Hales, and many more. And I think the lasting impact of Scott as an historian stands out. There is something vital, there's something interesting about Scott as a historian, whatever his intellectual background. He was impactful. And I think you had as part of your thesis that he understood the common person, and he was able to write that context and manners with such effect. And of course, others like Robertson tried to do that. They tried to make Mary Queen of Scots a human character who we could empathise and sympathise with. And really, Scott was the one to bring that to perfection. And I think this is why, in his own time, but still today, he's still relevant as a historian. And I think you gave us a wonderful encapsulation of all of that. And you've certainly urged me to go back and reread some of his works, including Tales of a Grandfather. And I think that's always the best sign of any Scott lecture, when you want to go back and reread Scott. So please join me, everyone, in thanking Ian for what was really a memorable and enjoyable lecture.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, David, for the vote of thanks. Thank you, Ian, again for such a wonderful and enjoyable talk. And thank you, Ian, for chairing our AGM earlier. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. And the evening is not over. I believe we can step outside and partake of something rather marvellous. So do join us there. Thank you.